Okay, in this project what we're going to do is we're going to use the Soundcraft mixer for hardware audio summing of the tracks in the Let It Be recording that we made. We're going to be running our audio out through the spaghetti over here in the patch bay over to the Soundcraft board, where we're going to be actually doing a final mix of the tune, bringing that back as a stereo pair into Pro Tools and recording it into the session. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to set up the session so that we can then patch it in through the patch bay and get the audio happening. Okay, here is our Pro Tools session of the Let It Be recording we made last year. And what I want to do is show you how we can go about sending these tracks out via the patch bay to the Soundcraft so we can actually do a summing of the audio tracks in the analog realm, bringing it back into Pro Tools through the stereo bus of the Soundcraft. So we have to do a few things to get the project set up and ready to send out to the Soundcraft. The first thing we need to know is that in our studio we have 8 ins and outs that we can listen to through the audio interface. We have an additional 8 that we've used, as I showed you. If you want to use mic preamps in the Soundcraft, you can plug in and access 9 through 16, but you can't play back through them. So we're limited to only 8 ins and outs for summing purposes. So you'll see I've eliminated the vocal track, partly just to make this simpler and to have less tracks to deal with. Eventually what you might want to do when you have a bigger mix is do a submix of various sections. Send the submixes to the Soundcraft, balance, do your mixing based on the submixes, and then bring that back into Pro Tools. And that's kind of what I'm going to do here on a small scale. So we're limited to 6 ins and outs because we need to reserve 2 to actually hear the mix through the stereo bus that we always listen to on the master track, the SP-Diff left and right. So we can only use 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 to go in and out of the Soundcraft, because we want to keep 1 and 2 so we can listen. So if you look at the number of tracks we have 2 tracks for the aux return. That's our reverb. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We got 8 tracks to fit into 6 slots, so we can't do them all individually. We're going to have to do a submix. So I'm going to do a submix of the drums. I'm going to mix down the drums to 1 track, and then I'll have the 2 tracks for the aux, 1, 2, piano 3, guitar 4, bass 5, and the submix mono for the drums will be track 6. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build my submix. So highlight the overhead track, do a Command-Shift-N, do a, in this case mono, because we're really limited with the number of tracks we have. Do a mono aux track, hit create. It'll build this aux track right next to the drum track, and I'm going to double click that and call that drum sub. Now in order to make this the sub, what we're going to do is this is going to become like a mini master fader for just the drum tracks. So now we're going to set up the sub. The submix is going to go to the output left and right, 1 and 2. But the input is going to be a bus. This is kind of like a send. So we're going to have the input of this, it's only mono. So we just need 1 track as a bus. So we're going to use bus 3 as the input of the sub. And then we're going to set the output of these tracks not to the master fader now. We're going to send it to bus 3. So these 3 drum tracks are redirected as their actual output. Don't use the sends. The send will still work. The send is going over here to the aux track through 1 and 2. But now instead of going out to the master fader, SP-Diff, these 3 drum tracks are going to the drum sub. And as I play it, you'll see that we do have the drum signal coming through. And you see if I solo just the sub, I don't have it. But if I solo the drum tracks that are sending to that sub, then I have those tracks isolated on the drum sub. So now my drum submix represents these 3 drum kit tracks. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tracks that I can send over to the Soundcraft. So I'm just going to work through the outputs here of each of these tracks and send them into the first 6 channel strips of the Soundcraft. So I'm going to do that by clicking on their outputs and using the individual tracks other than 1 and 2, the individual output channels on the Avid audio interface. So the drum sub is going into output 3, the bass is going into output 4, the guitar is going into output 5, and the piano is going into output 6, which is here. It's actually 8 at 4, but that's because, remember, we're using these numbers way out here on the right. That's actually 6. Then my aux return, which is where my reverb lives, that's going to go to a stereo pair 7 and 8 because I want to keep that stereo reverb. Okay, so what we got here is the drum sub being driven by bus 3 as its input, going to output number 3. So output 3, 4, remember they're two numbers higher, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I'm going to turn my master off right now. I'm not going to listen to the master anymore because I don't want to hear it. I want to hear what comes back to me from the Soundcraft. So I'm going to make one more track over here at the end. I'm going to highlight the aux, do Command-Shift-N. I'm going to make one stereo, and I want to make it an audio track because I do want to record this into the mix. So don't use an aux track. It'd be tempting to think that, but you really want to use an audio track so you can record it. So hit create. I'm going to call this my Soundcraft return. This is going to be returned on interface 1 and 2, and it'll be going to the output SPDIF, and I'm going to need to select the input so that I can hear it even when it's not in record mode. So this becomes my listening track to the output of the Soundcraft board. It also will be the track where I will record the Soundcraft mix into my Pro Tools session so I have it saved. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is go over to the patch bay and I'll show you how to patch this up. Okay, so I'm going to show you now how to patch the audio tracks from Pro Tools into the first 6 channel strips of the Soundcraft board and then come out of the Soundcraft stereo bus and go back into Pro Tools so we can hear the hardware summing that's happening in the Soundcraft board. So we're going to come out of the Avid outputs 3 through 8 that we assigned those tracks to the outputs in Pro Tools. We're going to go into the Soundcraft mic pre-ins 1 through 6. So 3 through 8 goes over here into 1 through 6. And then we're going to be coming out of the Soundcraft stereo outs, which are over here where it says SC stereo outs. These two. And we're going to be going over here to Avid input 1 and 2 so we can actually hear it. So we can do our balances, a little final EQing over in the Soundcraft, and we can get our final summing mix the way we want it, record it back into Avid via input 1 and 2. So I'm going to have to grab a bunch of cables. I'm going to be coming out of Avid 3, going into Soundcraft mic pre 1, 4 into 2, 5 into 3, 6 into 4, and these are our two left and right stereo reverb tracks. So I'm going to use the black and the red just for that. And then 8 goes into 6. Then we need 2 more patch cables. Might as well grab a red and a black one. Red is right. So we're going to come out of SC, Soundcraft, stereo out. 1, just the left channel, is going over here into Avid input 1. And the right channel is coming out of Soundcraft, stereo out 2, going into Avid 2. Okay? Cool. Now we should be able to get some sounds over on the Soundcraft board, finish up our mix, and bounce it back into ProTools. So over here in ProTools, I have the track rolling, and I think you can see that at this point, even though the input is on, the track that I set up to have the return for the Soundcraft isn't getting any signal yet. We have to go over to the Soundcraft and actually enable a bunch of things in order to make it work. First thing we need to do is look at these first 6 tracks. You can see that it is playing. I'm getting signal coming through here. These clip lights are bouncing on. I mean, we got lots of signal. That's not the problem. We don't have it routed yet. So there's a couple of things we need to do. First, these switches right next to the little green light, which in some channel strips you can read them. They say the word on. Some of them are faded because from use. But we want to make sure that all the first 6 tracks, the first 6 channel strips, are on. Next thing we want to do is assign them to the mix. So there's the top button. Again, some of them you can read better than others, but we want it to say mix. And we want first 6 tracks to have the mix button down and the on button on. And then we can pull up some faders. We're still not hearing anything because we have to go over here to the output section and turn up the output, which is the yellow faders. Now we'll just turn them up a little bit because we've got a lot of distortion, we've got a lot of overloaded inputs going on here. So I'm going to back over to the first channels, go up to the input section. I want to turn the pads on. That should make these peak lights go out. And go through track by track, get the levels up to the point where they don't quite peak. I want it to be as hot as possible, but not so hot that the red light comes on. For the 2 tracks that are the aux return for the reverb, I want to make sure that it's the same level on both sides. And the other thing that I want to do is on these 5 and 6, which is the aux return, I want to make sure they're panned hard left and right. Panner is the yellow knob. The others I'm going to put up the middle. This is going to be a very vintage, kind of almost mono mix, but I want my reverbs to be panned out left and right. So I'm going to pan the yellow knobs all the way to the right, all the way to the left. So now I can go back over to the input section, turn my yellow master faders up a little bit more till it starts to look like a good level in Pro Tools. So I'm turning this up and watching my return track. You can see over here in Pro Tools now that my return track has got level on it. And that's what I'm watching as I push these yellow knobs, these yellow faders up. I want to make sure I have them as high as I can possibly get them without introducing clipping over in Pro Tools. Ideally what we want to have is the faders up relatively close to that dark line, which is called unity gain. Probably not going to be able to do that without turning the trims back down. Sometimes you want to balance between where the faders are at unity gain and what the level is looking like in Pro Tools by pulling the trims back down a little bit. Sometimes you want to mix actually with your trims rather than your faders. It's less, in the analog world, it's less noisy. So once we get over here, we can do some fine-tuning of EQ. So remember, I've got drums, bass, guitar, piano. I'm going to brighten up the guitar a little bit. Put a little more high end on the piano. Maybe try and mess around with the bass just a bit more. I'm going to put a little high end on the reverb and maybe a little high mid just to make it a little grittier. Going for a little bit of a vintage sort of sound. Okay, so at this point, I'm pretty much good to go. The next thing I could do is go over here to Pro Tools, go to the beginning of the track, take my looping off, put this track into record, and record the whole thing down. Then I'd have a hardware summed analog mix of this track burned into the Pro Tools session if I wanted to use it. And you could use it to compare A and B between what this hardware summed mix sounds like compared to what the bounce in the digital world sounds like, and you can kind of see the difference between them. It'd be kind of interesting to compare. Okay, that's that project, so have some fun with it. See ya.